climate conversations we've already had. Welcome to Climate Conversations. This is actually a follow-up to one we held in the spring. This is the risk vulnerability assessment. We have two presenters this evening, Layla Pike from GEI Consultants and Gail Bonis from Gulf of Maine Research Institute. They will be presenting on the sea level rise, flood, and inundation and risk assessment for the city of Bath. I'm going to advance a slide, I believe, if I can just click there.
With the arrow.
Record.
Let's start video.
Actually, I should also invite the folks that are virtually with us this evening on Zoom. Let us know if we're audible and if you can see, and we'll adjust if we need to.
Maybe you have to.
Okay. All right, learning as we go. So this evening's presentation, and Layla will get right into actually number 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's kind of the crux of what you'll hear tonight. I am really here to introduce you to the City of Bath Climate Action Commission. My name is Rod Melanson. I'm the Director of Sustainability for the City of Bath. So the Climate Action Commission started doing this almost 1 year to the day with the first climate community conversation. It is a group of local citizens that are working extremely hard. I just wanted to point out this timeline you'll see that's up on the screen about where they've been, where they're going, and I'll get into that a little bit. This report and study is actually going to dovetail with further planning that we anticipate over the next year and perhaps even longer when we do a full community climate action plan, kind of strategic plan that we're planning with the community. So what that timeline is kind of compiling all of the previous efforts that have happened dating back to even before 2008 when they did their first greenhouse gas inventory, the city. The Climate Commission has really getting its feet under itself in community engagement, this being one portion of that, but really when the planning efforts and public input come into play throughout this, that's one big lift that they need to do. Currently, we're at the risk assessment. We received a grant from the state to do this sea level rise study, and that's what's going to be discussed tonight. And then we plan on further greenhouse gas inventory analysis, further climate adaptation analysis, and developing a strategic plan for the city. So right now I'm going to hand it off to Layla. That's I just wanted to provide you the overview of how this fits into a broader planning effort.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Okay, so this is a follow-up, as Rod mentioned, to a presentation that I gave back in March. That presentation really talked a lot about the methods for this study, how we will be looking at flood risk. And since then, we've done the study, we have the results, and now we're presenting the results. So I'm not going to be spending much time talking about the details of the methods. I invite you, if you're interested, to ask me about that afterwards, or you can go back and watch the presentation. But there's a lot of information, so I want to touch on some of the results. So briefly to go over this, the project goals were to figure out what is likely to be flooded in the city and when. We looked at 3 timeframes: present day, 2050, and 2100. So the difference between those timeframes are sea level rise. We also looked at 2 different rates of sea level rise, an intermediate rate and a higher rate. We looked at storms, coastal storms, riverine, major riverine events, and your typical average daily tides and riverine flows. And then we did a broad overview after we got our results about some of the ways the city could adapt. And I just want to say that a lot of these results, you'll be able to see some of the results in this presentation. There is a report that will be out to the public soon, and then there will also be an online portion of this that Gail is will be helping to create so that you can view these results online. I just want to say that a lot of the areas flooded that you'll see, you guys probably already know about. You already know the areas that are at risk. This study provides a lot of detail around the depth of flooding that may occur or the duration of flooding. So is it 2 inches of flooding for 30 minutes or is it 6 feet of flooding for 10 hours? So while we know areas that flood, this does provide some more detail and it helps us. It's one important step towards increasing resilience for the city. We can really focus in on areas that are very vulnerable, very exposed, and also very important to the city. So one of the reasons that the city has decided to do this is because the existing flood risk information is lacking. So we have the FEMA flood insurance maps. Those do not include sea level rise. They also, for the city of Bath, they do not include extreme riverine events. Those are just based on coastal storms. And there are sea level rise viewers out there. Sometimes these do not also include storm surge. Sometimes they do. They do not include the extreme riverine events. And they're oftentimes based on either the highest point in the tide cycle or the highest astronomical tide, which maybe we'll get once per year. So it gives you a great picture of areas, like a quick picture of areas that are vulnerable, but diving into those details of, will this place see flooding every single day or just during storm events? This is really what this study shows us. So as we know, the city of Bath experiences flooding. This is from that storm last December along Commercial Street near the Kennebec Tavern, one of the vulnerable areas that I'm sure you all know about and that this study confirmed. So just to reiterate that this is already an issue for the city of Bath. Okay, quick overview of the methods. Part of the methods. We looked at a lot of different flood scenarios. So we looked at your typical tides, just an everyday occurrence in Bath with tides and rivers, now 2050 and 2100. We looked at coastal storms. We looked at 100-year coastal storms, the event that would have a 1% chance of happening any year, or maybe once every 100 years, although that's not really how it translates, but it's known as the 100-year event. We looked at 100-year coastal storms. We looked at the combination of 100-year coastal storms and 100-year riverine flows, because a lot of times when we get those big coastal storms in Maine, there's also a big precipitation rain event that occurs. So we looked at the 3 different time frames. We had 2 rates of sea level rise, and we also increased those river flows in the future due to some increased precipitation that may occur. And that led to a total of 15 different flood scenarios that we looked at. We numbered those 1 through 15. This table you will see in the report if you look at it someday. In general, mapping scenario number 1 would be the lowest flood risk, and mapping scenario 15 would be that the highest amount of flooding. It generally gets worse, but that is not always true. So for example, I'm going to talk a lot about scenario 3 and 4. Mapping scenario 3 would be our combined 100-year coastal storm and 100-year riverine flows for today's sea level. So what we might see today. Mapping scenario 4 would be areas that might flood during typical high tides in 2050 using 1.5 feet of sea level rise. So while that's a higher map scenario, it actually doesn't show as much flooding as the storms we see today. So just have that caveat. Sea level rise. So we're following the Maine Climate Council sea level rise guidance. So they have suggested following NOAA's intermediate and high rates of sea level rise. And they have labeled them as commit to manage and prepare to manage sea level rise amounts. So they have suggested, or they have recommended, that municipalities commit to managing that intermediate rate of sea level rise. So when you're doing these studies, when you're building new infrastructure, to really take into account 1.5 feet by 2050, 4 feet by 2100. However, since sea level rise is still pretty variable, and especially much more unknown as we get out into the future, they have said, we want you to commit to this lower level, but be prepared to see this higher rate of sea level rise. And that would be 3 feet by 2050 and 8.8 feet by 2100. So we looked at all 4 of those values. And the way we did this is we built a 2-dimensional hydraulic model for the city of Bath that took into account the riverine flows and the coastal tides for all 15 scenarios. And then we had 15 sets of results. Okay, so for the results, we broke the results down into summaries of flood exposure. So as I mentioned, we had 15 flood scenarios. For each set of results at any point in the model in this area, at any of the points, you'll be able to get depth of flooding, duration of flooding, the peak water surface elevation. We could extract data such as the length of the road flooded. So there's a lot of information. And there's a lot of flood scenarios. So we summarized that. So for our results, we did a summary of flood exposure, and we broke that down into transportation infrastructure, buildings, open space, public safety. And then we took some of the assets such as roads, and we provided more detail. So we outlined the depth of flooding, that duration of inundation for each road in Bath and each of those 15 different flood scenarios. So that information is all available in the report. And then another way that we have spoken about these results and are thinking about them are in terms of areas that would likely see flooding during high tides and areas that would likely see flooding during extreme events. Because in terms of adapting the city or how we might think about different pieces of infrastructure, we might think about things differently for a road that we are likely to see flooding every single day during high tide versus just during those extreme events. So we differentiated those in the results and the discussion in the report. So here's an example of some of those summaries. So this isn't the detail, and these aren't the figures. This is just some summaries we have. So for those 15 different flood scenarios, for our transportation in Bath, we have roads, bus routes, sidewalks, and railroads. We can get a sense of how many miles are expected to see flooding for each of those scenarios. So for example, if we look at scenario 3, that's present day conditions combined riverine 100-year coastal and riverine event. We're expected to see 1.1 miles of road inundated. And then, as I mentioned, scenario 4 would be that 2050 for the lower rate of sea level rise. And that would be 0.1 miles of road inundated. Scenario 10 is that higher rate of sea level rise in 2050 for just your typical daily conditions. And that would bring us up to almost a 1 mile of road that would likely be inundated. So I'm also including the summary table for buildings. So that top row has the total number of buildings that would likely experience flooding. And then we were able to break that down into type of building. So commercial, municipal, institutional, residential. I have one line specifically for BIW, and that's mainly because the data set that we use that has buildings had a lot of what appear to be temporary storage buildings on BIW property that were included in that data set. So the numbers here are likely higher than reality. A lot of those buildings may not exist anymore. So I wanted to isolate that so that you don't just see that scenario 2, 84 buildings. Well, 32 of them are on BIW and they might just be little storage sheds. So I would dive more into how many residential buildings, in which case, so for scenario 3, that would be that combined 100-year coastal storm and riverine event for today's sea level. And we are expecting about 44 buildings that would be at risk of flooding. Scenario 4 is 2050 with 1.5 feet of sea level rise and your typical daily tides. And we're expecting about 13 buildings to experience flooding. The buildings are not under residential. That does not necessarily mean a house. The buildings included sheds and garages, so it could be a boathouse. It's really just a structure that's on a residential property. Okay, so then we went through, so for roads, I'm going to talk about roads mainly in this presentation. We identified several roads that we think the city of Bath should prioritize in terms of adaptation. And that was based on the risk of flood exposure and also how many people may be impacted if that road were to be inundated. So I'm going to talk through some of those near-term concerns, as we called them. These are in no particular order of more serious or not more serious. So I just want to say that. The first area that I want to talk about, and as I mentioned, you all probably know that these are areas that are likely to be flooded, is Washington Street near the Harvard Street intersection. So all of these little orange squares are buildings. And then we have the inundation boundaries. So this is just one of our scenarios. And I decided to show that high tide with 3 feet of sea level rise. So this would be in 2050 under that prepare to manage scenario. And under that scenario, we would see flood. We would expect flooding along Washington Street. This area is also likely to flood during today's sea levels and that combined storm event. And there's no other way to get to Washington Street north of this intersection. So there is approximately 60 buildings. And again, that's buildings, not necessarily houses. Approximately 60 buildings that are located north of this intersection that wouldn't be able to evacuate necessarily during a major storm event, or emergency services would not be able to access that location. There are details. So this one slide I provided like a little box that we have on our figures in our report that have some details on flood duration. So scenario 10 is the one that that inundation extent. So that would be during high tide. We would expect about 3.2 feet of flood depth there for about 5 to 6 hours. So during that 5 to 6 hours, it may be impassable. And then as the tide recedes, you could pass again. And that point, that 3.2 feet, that's at the lowest point of the road. So, the crown of the road, as it goes up a hill a little bit, it wouldn't be that deep. That's We just reported that deepest value. Okay, so the next area is the Butler Head area. So the intersection of Butler Head Road and Varney Mill Road, that's a low-lying area. Butler Head Road, where it goes very close to the shore. It is expected to be inundated during high tides in 2050 for the commit to manage. So that's that lower rate of sea level rise, 1.5 feet. And then for storms today. And there are about 14 buildings that are accessed off of that road. Varney Mill Road is expected to be inundated in 2050 for that higher rate of sea level rise for just daily flooding. And then today for major events. And if that were to be inundated, then Butler Head Road would be inaccessible, as would everywhere off of Varney Mill Road. And so that's about 45 buildings. So that stuck out to us as an area for priority action. And then as we zoom out a little bit of the Butler Head region, there's a pinch point or an access point that we've identified. And so North Bath Road is at risk of flooding presently during storm events, and in 2050 during high tides for that higher rate of sea level rise at 3 feet. If that were to be inundated, then you could still access that area along Ridge Road. However, we'll go to the next slide. This now shows inundation extents during coastal and combined coastal and riverine storms for 3 feet of sea level rise. So if a storm were to come in 2050, then Ridge Road then also becomes inaccessible, as well as North Bath Road. And then that whole region, which is over 150 buildings, would be cut off. So we've identified that area. And every time I give one of these presentations, I feel like I'm just spewing doomsday. And I really just want to say that this would be for 3 feet of sea level rise and a major event. So this is not something that is, some of these areas are of concern currently, but this whole area that I'm showing right now you're not going to lose access to all 150 of these buildings immediately. It's really why we're doing this study, so that you can see that, oh, this is a concern, this whole area is a concern, and we want to shape what we want Bath to look like in the future. And this allows us to really put thought into what you all want to put focus on and how you want to adapt. So it is not all bad news. It's actually like really excellent news that this is happening and that we can put thought into it. Okay, next is, this is Washington Street north of Hunt Street. And I remember seeing some pictures of this area being flooded during that December storm. So I know you all know that this area is at risk. We've identified that area. And then I'm just going to move on to downtown. So here, again, this is showing flood inundation during high tide, so not a storm event, for 3 feet of sea level rise. So that area near the Kennebec Tavern along Commercial Street, where it's very low lying, that is at risk of flooding. The other area that is low lying, which got a little bit cut out of this shot, but along Commercial Street, well, south of the bridge, it's kind of where the railroad is. It's very low there too. And those are the 2 points in downtown where water could really access the downtown region. So the next picture I'm going to show you is the same amount of sea level rise, but for a storm event. So 3 feet of sea level rise combined storm event. And then all of a sudden you see flooding. Water has gone across Front Street, along Water Street, and has somewhat isolated this area. And I just want to say that this looks worse than it is. So this is a storm event. So we are getting those peak tides that then recede. So this is not standing water. This is during the peak event. And also, so what I said before is there's a couple access points to this area. There's the low point along Commercial Street near the Kennebec Tavern, and then kind of south of that Route 1 bridge where the railroad is. If those two areas were elevated, or if there was some sort of flood barrier there, that could likely cut off water access to this area and really help reduce the flood inundation in all of downtown. So while this looks bad, it doesn't mean, oh, all of downtown is at risk, we need to elevate everything or move. There are some solutions that we could think about that could prevent flooding overall, if that is, one of the goals that everybody decides upon. Okay, so that was a very quick run through of some of the results. I really focused on roads there. The report also dives into pump stations, remediation sites, so brownfield sites, areas that had contaminated soil. Those areas, when they were addressed, maybe we weren't thinking about how someday they could be inundated. And if they are inundated, what does that mean for that contamination that may be still in place but capped? Does that cap still work if it's inundated? So we've highlighted some of those areas that maybe the city should think about investigating more. And we looked at the trail system. There's a lot of information out there. So I know that I spoke in March and then you didn't hear anything from me, and now I'm speaking again. But I just want to say that this past period was really me doing a lot of the work, and now that work is really going to shift to everybody else. Now we have the results. We've highlighted some broad strategies for adapting in the report, but we want to leave those decisions and those solutions up to the members of the community. So that's why I say that now the work shifts from me to you. And the next steps for this, so we have the city received another grant to extend this project to include a lot of community engagement, stakeholder meetings. We've brought on GMRI, which we're really thrilled about, to help create an interactive online map so that people can dive into these results. And I'm going to let Gail speak a lot more, but they're going to lead a community science piece and surveys to get community input. We're really going to explore some of these adaptation options in more detail. And then at the end of this study, we'll hopefully decide upon a pilot project for adaptation for the city and bring that to a conceptual design. And I'm going to hand it off to Gail. Yeah. Should we do questions now or at the end?
Why don't we let's do the presentation, then we'll do the whole question and for that.
I'll be quickish. All right, and there's no mistake that this says South Portland. I know where we are. We just haven't done the work here yet. So I wanted to share with you some examples of projects that will be similar to what we'll do with the city of Bath, but that we've done in other communities. And I'll focus on South Portland. We've been doing a fair amount of community engagement work with them over the past few years. So Leila mentioned an online interactive website where you'll have access to the data for this report. If any of you are familiar with the term story maps through Esri's ArcGIS online system, I know those have become popular through various folks. It's a great way to create geolocated narratives about locations, and it's a great way to engage in data. So we'll be working closely with GEI as well. And again, I echo Leela, and now the work is shifting to you as well, to the community to tell the story of the data. And what does it mean to you when you look at those maps, and what are those impacts, particularly on thinking about the social impacts too? How can we bring that narrative into thinking about buildings and roads and the other infrastructure that GEI has highlighted? So as I mentioned, we've done this work with South Portland, and it's a very easily modified kind of system that we can work with in here to bring in those various maps. This is showing you a new dynamic flood inundation map that South Portland has, where we can put in different various layers under different scenarios to pop up and create a way for you to move in and around this map and to zoom in to view the data that GEI has created. And again, adding that local flavor and the narrative to these pieces is something that we'll do as well. So there will likely be various versions of this that will come out over the next, like the period of this project, as we continue to add to it over time. But again, we'll start with that mapping piece. Leela also mentioned community science. How many of you are familiar with community science or citizen science? Great, a couple folks. Awesome. So fairly interchangeable, those terms, citizen science and community science. It's a way for average folks, you and I, to engage in collecting data to answer really big questions. And a really big question that we have in the state of Maine, with 5,000 plus miles of tidal coastline, is what weather and water level conditions lead to local flooding. And the reason we don't know that is because there's only 3 long-range water level monitors from NOAA in the state. 5,000 miles, 3 tide gauges. So there's a lot of ground to cover. And the closest NOAA one to Bath is in Portland. So we've developed this community science project to engage communities in getting out during these high water events, either predicted high water from a high tide, or during a storm if it's safe, or following a storm, to see where the water has gone. So that way we can better understand what those water level and weather conditions are that are leading to local flooding. So we'll be working with Rod and his team to identify coastal flood monitoring sites. Here's some examples from South Portland. These are sites that would be on the vulnerable today kind of side. So also using the data that GEI developed and looking at those locations. There are sites that are kind of publicly accessible, safe to access. And we also want to look at the range of various impacts across infrastructure, ecosystems, places of social or cultural value within a community. So we'll work with you all to identify these locations in Bath. And then we'll offer community engagement resources to get folks out making these observations. So we have an online website and a protocol that you can fill out on your smartphones to answer questions about the weather that you're experiencing in the moment, to upload photos of the water level that you're seeing, to answer some questions about the water conditions, if it's calm, if it's wavy, what size are the waves. And then there's also questions around what's your level of concern over this event that you're witnessing? What types of adaptation options would you be interested in seeing at this location? And we also invite narrative or stories of flood events that you've seen at this location in the past too. So we've worked with the National Weather Service on developing that protocol, those questions. And so they'll be receiving that data to ground truth their models and to support them, as well as Rod and the planning teams here in Bath. And we're also developing out through some other projects a classroom curriculum to engage students in going out and collecting this data too. So we'll be thinking about elevating youth voice and getting students really engaged in this process. All this data will be accessible through that website. It's all publicly accessible, so you can view this data over time. This year, through another funded project from the National Science Foundation, we're working on developing a more robust data viewer. So you can look at citizen contributed data alongside with water level data from the most local water level monitor, and that probably looking at statewide layers for climate projection data, because we'll be looking at this on a statewide level. So it will be a more robust data viewer. So we're really excited about that. And although that project is focused on other communities, every community that's participating in the community science project will receive kind of those resources and have access to them. So it'll look a lot different in a year, and we're really excited about that too. And I noted their most local water level monitor. You guys actually have one now. And did we ever figure out who's paying for it? All right, so no, it's not us. I'll figure it out. Anyways, so when we first started this project, looking at answering the question, what water level and weather conditions lead to local flooding, I very naively wrote grants and got some funding to develop this project, thinking I could just, toss out some cheap water level monitors and we'll get that data. So that technology didn't exist in like 2018. So it took a little bit of time for the tech world to catch up, and really fortunate that there have been a few startup companies that have launched readily accessible kind of service technology, which creates a great platform with access to that data. And so it's affordable. So it's not creating an added kind of maintenance or resource need for communities, and it's at a low price point that we're not too sure who's paying for it, but anyway, so it's easily accessible. So down on the Maine, the Maritime Museum, there we go, thanks. The Maritime Museum property, there is a Hohonu water level monitor. This is a picture of one on GMRI's pier, but you now have one here in Bath too. So if you go to Hohonu's website, you can view local real-time water level data. And so we've started working with this startup company. They're out of the University of Hawaii, and it's been great to collaborate with them. They've learned a lot too about Maine and our vast tidal range and sea smoke. They weren't prepared for our cold winters, so they've adapted their technology to work really well in this environment, and we'll be continuing to work with them. And we'll be able to bring the Hohonu data that you have here in Bath into that larger project too, which is great. And then I think the last point I wanted to make, and on that list of next steps that Leela shared, is a lot of community conversations, and that we really want to get input from you all. And I like to start talking about climate change by not talking about climate change, and really talking about what it is that you all value as a community. What is important to you in this city? What do you love about living here? What are you worried about? What do you wish for your future? And if we have that data to start the conversation, we can better look at how your values could be assets in building out this climate resilience plan, and also which of your values are vulnerable under these various climate projections, and how can we address those along the way too. And through another funded project, it's been a busy summer. We're a partner on another National Science Foundation project that Brown University is leading. And we'll be working with 2 communities in Maine, alongside with 2 communities in Rhode Island, and Bath is one of them, as well as Rockland. So we'll be able to bring in expertise across social science, health, data, climate science, to better understand what, particularly in a working waterfront, how does a community build kind of health and resilience moving forward. It's a brand new project, so that's really about the extent I know about it right now. We're having our first team meeting Friday and Saturday this week, so be happy to share. You'll be hearing a lot more about that over the next 4 years. So that will build a lot off of the work that GEI has started, and will complement the work that Rod and his team are doing through their climate action planning process. Right. So that's all I've got.
Thank you. And we now have plenty of time for question and answers. We do have some online questions too, but I'll kind of try to facilitate this portion. I do want to start by saying It may have been misadvertised. I think John picked it up. It's not 7:30. We get kicked out of the library at 7. So I just wanted to make that clear. But why don't we start with questions? I know that you have one here, and then we'll go to the online after this one.
I'm really heartened to hear how thorough you folks have invested yourself in the city with such research and just the encompassing approach. It's really heartening to me to see that there's this on the ground expertise, decentralized, focused on our communities and encouraging our investment funds for involvement. So my initial question, I think you've answered. Well, both of you have said we don't know the type of storm that would bring this various levels 3 and 4. We don't yet know what type of storm. So far, what we've seen that has hit New York, that's hit Vermont, that's hit East Coast, we haven't been hit. We haven't really dramatically been hit. But yet other areas have been flooded. So we're looking at an increased or more dramatic effect of climate, right?
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat the question to make sure I get it and for our online audience. So the question is that we're seeing other states and other areas like New York get these major events, these major flood events that we are not really experiencing yet. And I think that's true. There are, we do see these devastating floods in other areas that we have not seen to the same extent. But I do think we are seeing an increase in flooding. We're seeing both in coastal storms causing beach erosion in southern Maine, where we have sandy beaches, and also these small cell but extreme rain events that have been hitting our state in various places that are causing major road washouts. This past weekend up in Mid-Coast, there were some major road washouts at bridge crossing, culvert crossings that were caused by these extreme rain events. So we are seeing some. It's totally agree, not to the same extent, but it's good to be prepared.
Can I just add one more piece to it? And like a reason why we're not telling some of those same stories is because we already have this resilience of our tidal range. So we have this 8 to 12 foot tidal range, and we're not talking about Hurricane Sandy here, not because it didn't come here. We did get effects from Hurricane Sandy. There was a 4 foot surge, but it happened during a low tide. So we just didn't have a low tide that day in our height, and it left by the time the high tide came around. So we have this built-in resilience, but as sea levels rise, our exposure to these storms that will come through is just going to increase over time, and we'll be more vulnerable. And it's not that we'll see these larger storms, but it's that the storms we're experiencing today are just going to have bigger impacts because the water level is already going to be higher.
I'm going to do an online one, and then we'll start taking notes. My desk still got your impersonation. So this would be, could you come back to the slide showing the Hunt Street Station, Washington Street area? So you can talk about the implications for the south end of that.
Yeah. So I think this is the slide. So this is that north of Hunt Street. There was flooding there during that December event. I saw a picture. There is, I believe, to see because of the inundation boundary, but this is a very marshy area on the coastal, the seaward, the river side of this street. And there are several properties there that would be affected. There is an alternate route around this area. So it did stick out to us as an area that is at risk of flooding, and these buildings will be impacted. But Hunt Street itself is, for this scenario, this 3 feet of sea level rise and the this is just 3 feet of sea level rise. Hunt Street would still be accessible there. So you could drive around. So there are implications, you know, and I don't have the inundation extents for those higher rates. So perhaps in 2100 we will see some flooding there. We'll have to look at the results together. But there is a drive around there. So it's something to think about for how to manage this area, but you wouldn't isolate the whole southern area of Washington Street.
Kind of follow up too, that is part of our ongoing planning effects of where the beginning of our effort to really focus in on what this means and how we move forward with dealing with it over time. So that's for the implications, that's what we have to do. And this first step really has identified and begun that prioritization of areas that will see nuisance flooding versus that more catastrophic. So more questions. Yes.
I have two. I think given the surprising weather patterns that we've seen around the world in the last 6 months, I'm worried now about our waste treatment plant, which would seem to me to be very vulnerable.
The wastewater treatment plant. So just to repeat the question for everybody online, the question is around being concerned currently for the wastewater treatment plant. The wastewater treatment plant was not included specifically in this study. Well, it is included in the study. I mean, everywhere in Bath in the city extents is included. But I believe there is a separate climate plan that's happening for the wastewater treatment plant.
So we've in March of 22 there was in 2022, Ray Pierce did a study for the wastewater treatment in all of the pump stations as well, and the infrastructure associated with wastewater treatment. The plant itself, correct me if I'm wrong, actually is not inundated through some of these scenarios until we get wet, and even at the 2100, if we can remember. But that actually in this prioritization is not a major concern for the city. Some of the pump stations will be, and we need to address those. The treatment facility itself is actually elevated fairly well.
And there are, just to keep going on that, there are, I know about at least a couple of wastewater treatment facilities in the state of Maine that are currently being adapted for flood risk. So, you know, one in particular that I'm involved in is, you know, we're putting a wall around the facility to prevent flooding. So that is a concern in many places in Maine. And yeah, there are steps that we could take. Yeah.
One of the limitations in assessing the impact of whatever inundation is coming is the quality of the topographic data. I'm kind of curious what deficiencies we see there, and is there something that needs to be addressed in the future?
Yeah, great question. So the question is around how one of the limitations for these studies is the quality of the topographic data that is used. So for this study, we used LIDAR data from 2020, USGS LIDAR data for the upland area, and bathymetry data was available from NOAA, which was compiled from many surveys that have been done. Some of them are quite old, I will say that. Some of these riverine surveys are quite old. So I actually feel pretty good about the topography data that was used for this study. It has it's very detailed. I don't think I have in this presentation. My old presentation, I did have it. I don't have it here. We also a lot of times when we create surfaces for these models, we're just looking at the earth. We actually put the buildings back into this surface. So this is more in detail than anybody really needs to know, but when planes fly to collect LiDAR data, they're pinging down points, and those points sometimes land on tops of trees or buildings, and then they also land on the ground, which is called bare earth. And then they post-process that to take out the trees and the buildings and just give you that bare earth, so that when you're looking at river flows, you're not having an artificially high spot because of all the forest that is there. So we took that bare earth, but then we took our data of where buildings are located and built that back into the model. So the buildings were there because we're expecting flooding downtown, and we wanted to see how that water would move around the buildings and how the buildings would impact the flood extents. That being said, there are constantly projects, construction being happening on the shoreline. Buildings, like I said, in BIW are popping up and being taken down all the time. So it's a snapshot in time, this data. It could always be improved with more survey. And that's one of the limitations for this study, especially around pump stations, is we talk about depth of flooding based on that bare earth elevation. So we've identified a pump station that may be flooded. Well, in reality, that pump station, the water may need to be 1 or 2 feet off of the ground before it actually affects that pump station. Perhaps it is protected. Perhaps there isn't a lip into the infrastructure. And that was something that we did not include in this study. So we have highlighted, okay, these are the pump stations that you should look at more. And then maybe when they're looked at more, we realize, okay, they're actually not as at risk as we think they are. So definitely survey is huge for these studies. Yeah.
How do you see this impacting insurance?
Great question. I do a lot of work with FEMA flood maps. So my understanding is that your homeowner's insurance mortgage, a federally backed mortgage, if you're in a flood zone, a FEMA flood zone, and you have a federally backed mortgage, you are required to buy flood insurance. If you don't have a federally backed mortgage, they can't really make you do anything. We still suggest that you get flood insurance. And if you are not in a FEMA flood zone, then your flood insurance will be a lot cheaper than if you are in a FEMA flood zone, which is all the more reason to get flood insurance, no matter if you're in the zone or not in the zone. I don't think this study will affect insurance, but that the intricacies of that world are a little beyond me. Yes.
This isn't a question, it's encouragement.
Okay.
I would like to see that with very serious consideration, putting in at least one road garden, perhaps 2. That would help control excess, modest amounts of excess water in the city, and they can be quite beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that they are not cheap to build. I understand that. But I had read in the paper, and when there was a meeting I was able to attend a few months back, I actually turned in a paper that talked about rain gardens and said there are federal funds available, whether they're in the form of a grant or whatever. And Bath is such a wonderful place to live.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I thought, well, this is a great idea.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of flat lands near the river. And several years ago, I would say 5 or 6 years ago now, I attended a whole series of meetings along with hundreds of other people, where they had a team of people came in and told us what was going to happen, you know, in the next 100 years. And I don't know whether any of the results of those studies are currently, I mean, has that been integrated into what you're trying to do? You just get filed around.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'll briefly touch upon that. Stormwater management and rain gardens. And that DART study that you're referring to is definitely a driver of what Bath is continuing to go along the path with here in terms of climate planning. And these consultants have seen those reports and some of those concepts. So directly too, I think the new Torrey Gate area has a small rain garden stormwater management as part of that new park under the Route 1 bridge. There are concepts with Front and Elm Street design work happening right now that are incorporating street trees with rain gardens. And so those elements are, I think, baby steps incrementally happening. Where they make sense, that's where we'll be putting them. And it does take folks some time to get up to speed with some of that, but it's happening now. So it's good news there. Yeah.
Could you describe how a rain garden works, how it functions, just in general?
Yes. Yeah, I'll take that. So the question is about rain gardens and how they work. So rain gardens, so just to differentiate a little bit, this study was mainly riverine and coastal flooding that comes from the river. But as we know, there's also flooding that comes from rain events that land on the city and then run off into our stormwater system or into the river. So those events were not included in this study. We did not look at rain landing on the city. But rain gardens, so there's a huge movement towards green infrastructure in terms of management of stormwater. So the idea is a lot of our stormwater systems, and I guess I'm not familiar with Bath's stormwater system, but I imagine that this is the case in Bath, where wastewater from our house and rain runoff that lands on the road and goes into the stormwater system all heads to the wastewater treatment plant and then is treated and then is put in the river or in the ocean after it's treated. So during major rain events, what can happen is that the system gets overloaded because all of a sudden we have a ton of rain in that system. The wastewater treatment plant cannot keep up. And so it's just dumped and we have untreated wastewater that's, well, one, we have flooding in our street because we have major rain events, and we have untreated wastewater that is going out into the river. So there are many things that we can do to solve this. One is separating this infrastructure. There's a big movement in Portland happening so that stormwater and house wastewater are not in the same system. And what else? The other things we can do is slow down that rainwater so that it is not entering that system all at once and overloading that system. And the way to slow that down are using green infrastructure, storing that water in rain gardens, letting it land in the surface of our city and percolate slowly into a green storage system. So one way I like to describe a rain garden, I mean, this is just one of the methods, is if you have a big field, say you dig up all of the earth and you replace it with gravel. And then on top of that gravel, this is just a theoretical example. On top of that gravel, you put some more earth and the field again. So it looks like how it always looked, but you can store a lot of water in that field. So when it rains, that field can store water and then slowly drain that water when it's ready. Green infrastructure is very cool. So it could be swales, rain gardens. There's a lot of ways you can slow down water and store water so that you decrease the flooding on the streets and reduce your impact to the stormwater system. You're welcome.
I don't know if you said it, sorry, I missed it, but where can we access the full report?
It is not yet accessible. That's why you can't access it. We're doing some final edits. This looks like Rod. The question was around when we can access the report.
Soon, yeah, it's in draft form right now. So we're going through a staff review and comment and making sure that Public Works gets to see it, police, fire, emergency services. Layla's already met with them. There's some minor edits, street names that were incorrectly spelled, things like that. There's no, experts telling Layla how to do her job, which is good. But that will be very soon, really. I think within the month, we'll post it online, and then really get going on that next portion of our next steps and really engaging folks with, the decision-making process of what we do with this information. But that's another long process. But yeah. Soon.
Yeah, and I'll just say the report is very technical. I am an engineer, and everything I write, I have in my mind, like risk language. So you will notice that when you read the report. But that's why I'm so glad we're working with Gail, because we will be having this more user-friendly online interactive format to view the results as well.
And that doesn't have a date.
That does not have a date yet.
Yet.
No, that will be forthcoming at some point.
That's a great question. And so actually I didn't mention at the beginning of the meeting, there are exit surveys, basically, for folks who haven't come to one of these before. We'd ask that you fill out, why did you come and what do you want to see next? There is a complete event series that has been pre-planned, and Ruth Endrick from KELT is going to help me out here.
Nice. So they're on that table in the back. Then we've got you can check out, here's our lecture series information. Just a quick note, these do end at 7 o'clock, not 7:30 because the library closes. But we have a full series planned from now through March, and we're really excited about programs this year. And your input will help us decide what to add next year. I think next year will also include a lot of information related to the climate action plan process.
I want to put a plug in for KELT. They actually are going to be having a webinar series, not live, but a virtual series. That's part of this climate conversation.
Oh, yeah. We're with the experts to talk about farming and fishing and carbon storage in forests, and have 3 different panelists in the wintertime. So we'll put out information about that too. So please sign up on the sign-in list, and we'll make sure that you get the information about Climate Action Commission and our work. Last year, the city of Bath had an intern who put together some really wonderful guidelines or guidance books for saving energy in your home or apartment or with transportation. And I think the last Climate Action Commission thing coming up soon is there's a window build for window dressers happening at Freight Shed next week. I think that they need some more volunteers. And so on the city, where's the best place to find the sign up for that?
Yep, on the city website. Or you can just actually go on to the windowdresser.org website, community builds, and hit Bath, Maine, and there's signups if you want to do that. Or you can just swing in to the Freight Shed. It's actually pretty incredible to see the Santa's elves working hard making windows.
Aren't those built for specific windows that people come in and they build their own? What would we do if we don't have a window?
Well, you can come and say hi and say hello. So actually, it is set up where when you order a window, someone comes to your house and measures that window. But then part of the discounted window insert fee is that you sign up for a 4-hour shift. So you are providing labor in a discounted window insert, or in some cases they're free inserts. But if you are just wanting to be part of the build, you can sign up without any product involvement at all. They're you know, they're pretty old-fashioned barn raising type of builds. It's pretty interesting. Yeah, lots going on. Oh, and I'll plug the comprehensive plan for the city of Bath if you're relevant. There's a public hearing next week. And actually, I will say in that plug that the comprehensive plan does do a good job of leaning into climate planning and getting prepared, and setting us on a good course. So,
When is that?
thanks. That's Tuesday, the 17th. I think it's at 5 p.m. actually in City Hall. Yep.
Thank you so much for attending.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.